BRZEN.
Please note, this episode contains references to war and violence. Please take care whilst listening.
Major breaking news tonight, the fall of Kabul as the Taliban completes its takeover of Afghanistan. Armed fighters...
we have just heard a non-stop stream of choppers all morning going back and forth from the embassy to the airport. We also saw...
The presidential palace was officially handed over to the Taliban. Just remarkable images coming in all day long of this transfer.
As Kabul fell, Abdul and his wife and their 4 children peered out from the balcony of their safe house, trying to figure out what was happening down below.
People start running and moving towards their homes from the markets. So but nobody knew exactly what is going on and what will happen.
Outside, bands of Taliban fighters patrolled the streets. They carried Kalashnikovs and US-made M16 rifles abandoned by the Afghan army. They packed into American Humvees and the green trucks that had been used by the Afghan police, and they set up checkpoints all over the capital. Around the city, residents paced in their homes, worried, watching, waiting. Should they stay? Should they leave? Where would they go? How would they get there? Abdul had already been thinking about this for several months. He'd worked as an interpreter for the CIA in his home city of Kandahar. He had received threats from the Taliban in the past. He was in the process of applying for a special immigrant visa to move his family to the United States. It was a program for Afghans who'd worked with US forces, but he wondered if it was already too late. The safe house was in the office of an internet provider with an apartment for guests on the 3rd floor. Abdul's friend owned the company, and the place had everything the family needed: a kitchen where his wife could cook, Wi-Fi connection to follow the news, even a courtyard where they could get some air. It was also located near the US Embassy, in an area full of Afghan government buildings, prime territory for the Taliban to reclaim. Abdul left the flat only to buy groceries and to get a sense of what it was like on the streets. His children kept watch as Taliban vehicles rumbled by the house.
My child, sometimes they were coming out to the balcony and they were watching, and then they were very much scared and nervous, especially the youngest two. Look at their faces, no uniforms, and they are scary. That was the first time they were seeing them in Kabul streets. My elder son, who is now 18 years old, 5 to 6 times a day, he was just telling me, "Dad, you need to do something. Just contact, your American boss, if he can help us in getting out of here. I don't want the Taliban at all. Doesn't matter if they are good or bad." My eldest daughter, who is 22 now, she was very much kind of like in deep thoughts about her future. That if in case we doesn't get a way to go out of Afghanistan to America or anywhere else, what will happen to my education?
His younger daughter was 12. His younger son was just 10. Abdul did his best to reassure them.
I was just, telling my kids, that, don't worry, don't panic. I'm here.
Meanwhile, his wife tried to reassure him.
She was trying to prepare some meal for us 3 times and making phone calls with her parents, what's going on there, what's going on here, what happened. She was also giving me some moral support, saying that, okay, don't lose hope, don't lose, faith, and God is with us.
One night, not long after the fall of Kabul, Abdul and his family were trying to sleep when the building watchman woke them in the middle of the night. The Taliban were downstairs. Abdul gathered his wife and children. He tried to keep his voice from shaking.
And so I told my family that, you don't be panicked, just stay over here, let me go and talk to someone.
He followed the guard down 3 floors. In the doorway, 4 men with beards and turbans stared at him intently. They looked around 35 or 40 years old and were dressed in traditional Afghan clothes, their rifles resting on the ground next to them.
The long shirts Kalashnikov was pretty much fucking scary faces. And so they says that, who are you?
On the outside, Abdul seemed cool and collected. He didn't have any documents that could tie him to the Americans. Only photos of letters taken on his phone, and he'd given that to his wife. He knew the Taliban wouldn't search a woman. But his worst fear flashed through his mind. They could arrest him and separate him from his family.
But I was scared. My heart beats, very fast. My mouth's dry.
So he thought quickly and came up with a lie.
He says, well, I'm a guest from Kandahar. This is my friend's office and house. I'm here just for the medical treatment of my wife. She's not feeling well. That was the only thing I could say,
Abdul held his breath as the Taliban fighters considered his answer. They thought the house might be a government building. Maybe the cell tower on the roof had raised their suspicions, plus the fact that it wasn't far from the embassy. The night before, they'd already tried to get in and broken the surveillance camera.
So then, they says we need to search. He says, okay, but there is my family upstairs, If you want to meet or see them, you can do it, I'm not lying to you.
He thought about his wife and children huddled upstairs. Had he already seen them for the last time?
So then they says, okay, we will come by tomorrow again.
From Project Brazen and PRX, this is Kabul Falling. I'm your host, Nilafar Hidayat. This is episode 2, A Knock at the Door. The men left Abdul and his family alone, and they didn't return the next day. He couldn't explain why, but perhaps the Taliban were just too disorganized to come back. Even they were surprised at how quickly they'd taken Kabul. Fighters had rushed into the capital from nearby fronts to control the city. Some tried to maintain order. Others sprayed gunfire in the air or lashed out at pedestrians. They simply couldn't keep track of everywhere they wanted to search or everyone who might be a suspect. Afghans like Abdul, who'd worked with the Americans, feared retribution. But the Taliban also wanted revenge against those who'd served in the Afghan government, especially those who held progressive views.
I used to do so much work for my people, for women's rights, for children, for the education system of women.
That's Mohammad Jawed Khan. In the Paktia province, which borders Pakistan, Javed's brother was a member of the Afghan parliament, and Jawed worked as his aide. He was sure the Taliban would target them for it. They saw the Afghan government as illegitimate, propped up by foreign invaders. So after the fighters took control of their province, Jawed and his brother stayed home for several days hiding. Their mother kept watch around the clock.
My mother was awake all night, but because she didn't want to lose her son, she was just like a soldier was checking each and every door or window.
But before long, a large group of Taliban fighters turned up at Jawed's house. They surrounded the place. There were too many for him to count.
Taliban came and they checked each and every room and even washroom or everything.
When they found Jawed, there was no discussion, no chance to defend himself. They seized him and led him away. Back in Kabul, on the night of August 15th, a young man named Tariq was exhausted, his feet shredded and aching. That day, he'd gone into the center of the city to check on his visa application. He'd worked as a contractor on many American projects and had applied for a special immigrant visa, or SIV. It was the same program Abdul had applied to, designed for Afghans who'd worked for the Americans. Their cases were supposed to be a high priority, but in reality, the process could drag on for a long time, sometimes years, longer than Tariq could afford to wait. Like Abdul, he'd gotten threatening letters from the Taliban. So plan B was to move his family to Turkey until the US visas came through. When he left the visa agency, word had already ripped through the neighborhood. The Taliban had taken over.
When I came out from there, it was like complete chaos. The city was fallen, like everybody was running. It was a scary moment. You could see the fear on people's face.
His phone rang. It was the kindergarten where his 4-year-old Sultan went to school.
They asked me, like, you could come and pick your son. So I was on one side of the city and he was like completely on a different side.
The kindergarten was 5 or 6 miles away and the roads were mobbed with traffic. Lines of cars snaked around the capital, full of people desperate to leave. He tried to flag down a taxi, but none would stop. So Tariq began walking, clutching his family's visa materials tightly in a plastic file. He made his way through the crowds as quickly as he could. His phone kept ringing.
The kindergarten keep calling, like, everybody has left and you have to come and get him.
Tariq's mind raced with worry about his son. How was Sultan doing all alone? Did he think his father had forgotten him? He walked for hours through heat and havoc and swirling dust. The school was located near a famous hospital on Kabul's Darul Aman Road. The shortest route would take him over a steep pass running through the city. He wasn't dressed for a hike. That day, he wore a pair of sandals with a strap around the back. As he hurried uphill, the leather cut into his feet. Grit coated his toes, and still, there were miles to go. He passed through the Shorenau district, a fashionable neighborhood full of shops and cafes. Cars sped off in every direction. The traffic cops had left their posts, and drivers blasted their horns incessantly. People were running down the streets. Restaurant owners were frantically closing up shop. He glanced over at 2 popular spots, Barg and Tolo. Usually they were bustling with patrons. Barg's owners had locked the doors. Tolo normally had a lush display of fruits out front, but workers were moving the baskets inside as quickly as they could. Tariq figured they were worried about looting. He trudged on through the city's dusty streets, picturing his little boy sitting all alone, waiting for him.
Yeah, the only thing I was worried was if my son feels so lonely there, like if the teachers has left and everybody has left, he's going to be scared.
Tariq looked down at his feet. They were covered in blisters and nearly black.
I was wearing those sandals and I hate those sandals now. I usually wear sneakers, but that day I don't know why I was wearing it, so.
The day after Kabul fell, Ogai, a young journalist you met in the last episode, left her parents' house and went to hide out at a colleague's apartment. On the streets, Taliban flags fluttered from US military vehicles. Fighters stood guard around piles of looted equipment and posed for TV cameras. Ogai was careful not to go near any windows or doors in case the Taliban caught a glimpse of her.
There was a high risk for me and for my colleagues. Our boss, the chief of Abdul TV, called us that we are trying to get out of all of you to some countries, but we don't know where. Just be careful.
Abdul TV had highlighted women's achievements across Afghanistan, and they'd become international media darlings themselves.
A new television station in Afghanistan is turning the focus on women. At Zon TV, women's TV, they are on camera, in the guest chair, and in the control room.
Ogai had covered hard-hitting stories. In this clip, she's reporting on the Afghan women's national soccer team and their allegations of sexual abuse by coaches and officials. Ogai was active in sports herself. She started a cricket team for girls when she was just 14 years old. All of this made her a target for the Taliban.
They starting searching the women, especially activist women. They start the searching house by house.
Ogai was only 20, so she had no memories of life under the Taliban. But her boss, Hamid, remembered the ruthless, oppressive group that had ruled during the 90s. And while he believed they were still against democracy and human rights, he noticed that in some ways they were different.
They're coming with a different kind of faces, but if you just compare the Taliban with 1995 and now, they change it. The only change that you can see that before they don't care about the living or life, but now they really, they love to live. They love to, just participate in some international conferences. They love to try to have a connection with the international countries.
The new Taliban wanted recognition from the international community. They wanted legitimacy to govern the Afghan people. But my mother took me and my sister out of Afghanistan in the mid-90s because of the inhumane way that they treated women. She was scared for our lives, so we fled. This new Taliban, would they change their actions towards women? Ogai did not want to be around to find out. Zan TV was trying to arrange safe passage out of the country for its employees, but hadn't come up with anything concrete yet.
Unfortunately, some of our colleagues, they lost their hopes and they said that we will not go and maybe we will face with some problems.
But Ogai wasn't ready to give up. For the next few days, she remained in hiding, staying with co-workers, waiting for more details on her way out. On Darul Aman Road, Tariq had finally made it to his son's kindergarten after walking across the city for 4 hours. By then, Sultan was the only child left in the classroom. He'd been watching cartoons alone. All the teachers were gone. Just a guard and an administrative worker remained. When the little boy spotted his dad, his face lit up and he ran to his father for a hug. Tariq felt a wash of relief. His kid was safe. He scooped him up, kissed him, and held him close. Sultan asked why he was the last to be picked up, and why had Tariq come to collect him in the first place. The school had its own transport, and usually their driver brought him home at the end of the day.
I told him I missed you, and that's why I came here. So he didn't know the Taliban had came. My feet were so dirty because of the dust. Maybe he had felt like my dad is looking weird.
Tariq wanted to set his son at ease before they headed out into the unknown. He spotted some toys scattered around the classroom.
There were lots of toys, and we just before we leave, I played with him. There was a football. I played with him little inside that kindergarten, and that cheered him a little bit, and then we left that place.
It was around 2:30 in the afternoon. Tariq carried his son in his arms and Sultan clung to him tightly. Tariq's sense of relief gave way to anxiety. How was he going to get them home? He was exhausted and Sultan was too small to walk. The blazing sun wasn't helping either. They passed an ice cream stand and Tariq's son asked for a treat, mint chocolate. The boy ate it as his father searched for a taxi.
So he was living in his own world, so nothing was changed for him.
By this time, the panic in the streets had died down and the traffic had eased. They found a car, though the driver charged 4 times the usual fare. By the time they reached the other side of Kabul, it seemed as if most people had already fled.
The city was completely empty. There wasn't anybody at all.
When they got home, Tariq's wife threw her arms around him, overjoyed, then asked him to go take a bath. His feet were battered, dusty and dirty, except for the skin beneath the sandal straps.
So 2 different colors of my feet. Even the clothes were dirty too, my hairs were full of dust.
He and his wife and son were together and they were safe, but a much bigger journey lay ahead of them. Ogai was still in hiding, trying to keep her despair at bay. Suddenly, a lifeline appeared. 2 years earlier, she'd been filmed for a documentary by an organisation called Reporters Without Borders. The filmmakers contacted her from Europe with an offer to help.
They called us that this documentary will make a high risk for you. Then I said, okay, so what shall I do?
They quickly put together a plan. She would go to a hotel near the airport and hide there until her flight was arranged. Ogai moved with a purpose she hadn't felt in days. There was no time to pack. She had to be there in an hour and she could only bring 1 small bag. She grabbed her documents and a long black coat her mother had sewn by hand, decorated with silver coins. As her fingers brushed the fabric, she realized she had no idea when she would see her parents again. It was time to go. Her brother insisted on taking her to the hotel, and together, they flagged down a taxi. Abdul, the interpreter, remained in hiding with his family. He'd turned the Taliban away with a lie about his wife being sick, but he worried that they'd come back. His friend and former CIA colleague Phil, who was now living in Dallas, Texas, told him to sit tight whilst he looked for a way to escape.
We were in contact with Phil all the time. And Phil says that, I will try to, help you out in the evacuation process. So we stayed there.
Hours turned into days. The days turned into a week, and then more. With Phil's help, Abdul had applied for a US visa before the Taliban took over. But with the US embassy shut down and the country in chaos, the already slow-moving process had come to a standstill. Abdul had to keep putting on a brave face for his 4 kids, but the stress was written all over his body. He could barely sleep. He was too nervous to eat. He'd always been a chain smoker, but now he was going through 30 cigarettes a day and 6 or 7 cans of an energy drink called Al-Okazai. One evening, he received extremely worrying news. In Spin Boldak, a border town with Pakistan, south of Kandahar, the Taliban had raided people's homes and killed several villagers. He and Phil had carried out many of their missions there.
They have pulled out people from their homes and they have killed many people over there. So that caused more fear in our hearts and our minds.
Phil tried his best to keep up his friend's spirits.
We're sitting here in our comfortable homes with our comfortable lives. But for these Afghans who we were on the phone with nonstop, it was sheer terror, panic, concern, fear, dread, all of those things you can imagine. And there were thousands and thousands of Afghans in the same situation.
From his home in Dallas, Phil coordinated with a network of dozens of volunteers that had sprung up since the fall of Kabul. They were current and former CIA, military, contractors and NGO workers, all trying to get their Afghan friends and colleagues out.
We were constantly on the phone, all day, all night, texting back and forth, sharing maps, sharing information about what gate was open, where there was a threat. At the end of the day, it all came down to knowing a guy on the ground.
That is, knowing someone at the Kabul airport, where thousands of Afghans were gathering, hoping to get a flight out.
The system totally broke down. It's not like there was any central database of all the good guys that we need to rescue. It became kind of a freelance operation out there. If you could get in touch with someone you trusted, I think they had carte blanche in a way to go out and grab people as they could take a break from their work, managing passenger manifests or directing traffic or whatever they were doing.
Phil didn't know anyone at the airport. He kept working his contacts, but the clock was ticking.
The time is running fast and we are running out of time because the 31st of August is the last day of evacuation.
The US had negotiated that date with the Taliban, and it was a hard deadline. So on the 25th, Abdul told his wife and kids to start packing. Then the family, along with Abdul's cousin and his wife and children, headed to the airport. Ogai had to get to the airport too, but first, she had to make it to the hotel where Reporters Without Borders had told her to wait. Peering out the window of the taxi with her brother, Ogai could see the streets were quiet. But there were Taliban checkpoints everywhere, and they were questioning every car that passed. A Taliban fighter waved them down and leaned into the taxi. His long hair and beard did nothing to hide the menace on his face. Ogai looked at the gun dangling by his side.
I thought that there is no more life, okay, for you. They will kill you.
The men ignored Ogai, talking only to her brother. The fighters asked where they were going. "I'm taking my sister to the hospital," her brother answered immediately. Ogai held her breath, praying that the Taliban would buy his life and let them go without a search. Inside her backpack, there was a press card identifying her as a journalist for Zan TV. After trekking all day to reunite with his son, Tariq was still at home in Kabul. He'd seen mad scenes on TV showing thousands of people at the airport, frantically ramming to get in.
The chaos that was an airport, like more than 2,000 or 3,000 people were inside the airport and people falling from the airport. So I knew the first few days were like really hectic. And that's why I didn't attempt it like to go to airport at all.
He knew his family had no chance of making it through until he got an email from the US Embassy.
They had like send a visa like gate pass, something like that with a barcode on it. And then the body of email was like, you will be evacuated through the Abbey Gate inside the airport.
The American Embassy was telling them to go to Abbey Gate, one of the airport's main entrances. To Tariq, it seemed like a sign that the US finally had the situation under control.
So when I received the email, I thought things will be much better now. There won't be any problems.
He and his wife packed a few bags, got into a taxi with Sultan and his baby brother, and took off. An eerie calm had set in over the streets. No music, no one milling around the restaurants and cafes. He could see the signs of the Taliban asserting control over daily life, patrolling the city. They wore grey and green traditional Afghan clothes and long beards. They crammed into police cars, 8 men stuffed into one vehicle. They broke into a politician's house near where Tariq lived and made a base there. It was right across from the store where he usually shopped. Tariq saw a wildness in them, a barbarian-like quality even.
When I saw them, like they more looked like wild for me, just like when we see some of those ancient movies that some of barbarians attacks and those things.
He had reason to fear them. Over the years, he had received multiple threatening letters from the Taliban for working on American contracts. His father was also a high-ranking government official, and his wife had won a Fulbright scholarship to study in the United States, where their son was born. The Taliban had infiltrated their home village in the northern province of Baghlan, and Tariq believed they were tracking his family's movements.
They have specifically mentioned their names and their whereabouts, and you didn't respect our warning, and like, we know what you are doing, and you didn't listen to us, and we will come after you.
The taxi pulled to a stop about 200 or 300 meters from the entrance to the airport. It seemed to Tariq that the Taliban had fired tear gas to disperse the crowd. He made his way to the front and approached the Taliban.
I was able to get to the front. I told them like about my the barcode and the application and everything, the invitation to enter the Abbey Gate. At the line that I stand was like maybe around 100 people, but maybe more than 600, 700 people just standing on the other side of the street, not trying to go enter, not trying to push. It was crowded, but not that crowded.
But as Tariq got closer to Abbey Gate, he was surprised to see that people were running away from the checkpoint.
People were coming back. I didn't know what happened there. So I easily approached the front line on the first attempt, and I started talking with the Taliban and showed them like, my son's a US citizen and I have a special immigration visa. So please let us pass this checkpoint. And they were like, no, we stay here. The gate is closed. We will not let you in.
Tariq learned that only minutes before he arrived, the Taliban had shot someone in line. An ambulance took the injured person away. That's why he'd seen people running off, though there was still a crowd around the checkpoint.
And I stood there like for half an hour, like just trying to persuade them to allow me to pass the checkpoint.
Soon, others were returning to the gate as well. A woman stepped into line next to him. She told the guard she had received the same email from the US Embassy that Tariq had. She held up her phone to show him.
And then the Talib guy was like, oh, you should be ashamed why you're carrying the smartphone with yourself, like why you're having the Galaxy smartphone.
Tariq was shocked. Then he had to stop himself from laughing. The whole exchange seemed absurd. His attempts to pass the checkpoint were going nowhere. Tariq and his family returned to the taxi. He told the driver to keep going. Maybe they would have better luck at the airport's north gate. But it turned out he wasn't the only one with that idea. There were hundreds of people, maybe more. The Taliban guards fired their guns into the air, trying to disperse them, yet more crammed in. Tariq could see people running away from the checkpoint. Word buzzed through the crowd. The Taliban had shot another person. Getting into the airport seemed impossible. The Americans were not in charge. No one was.
I saw the environment and I couldn't believe that I would be able to get in there. Like with having 2 babies and my wife, I completely gave up this day.
Tariq and his family headed home exhausted. Later that day, he checked his emails again. He was surprised to find a message from an old colleague, an ex-Marine named Jake Cusack. "If you need assistance," the email read, "we will try to get you out." In our next episode of Kabul Falling.
Outside of the airport, there was lots of rush of people, children, women, and just Taliban firing, and Taliban, oh my God, beat them, and they cried and they said, we want to go, we want to go.
Everybody was having some sort of papers in their hands. True or false, God knows.
I see people climbing the walls who have guns, AK-47. And that's the time that I was cursing everybody on the phone, begging them to do something. Whoever contact that I had from American side, foreigners, I called them.
We want to hear from you. Please get in touch via our website, kabulfalling.com, where you can send a voice message or tweet using #KabulFalling. We'll share some of the best responses during the course of the show. Also, to support the women of Kandahar Treasure, you can buy one of their hand-embroidered scarves on our website. 100% of the proceeds will go to this women-owned collective in Afghanistan. Kabul Falling is a production of Project Brazen in partnership with PRX. It's hosted by me, Nilofar Hidayat. Bradley Hope and Tom Wright are executive producers. Sandy Smollins is the executive producer for Audiation. Our managing producer is Lucy Woods, and Eileen Meacham is the producer. Susie Armitage is our co-producer and story editor, and Siddhartha Mahanta is our consulting producer. Our associate producers are Dan Shin Huang, Fatima Faizi, Francesca Gilardi Quadrio-Curzio, and Neha Wadika. Additional reporting was done by Nigel Walker. Our translators are Hassan Azimi and Mahibullah Shadan. Arsen Fahim composed the original theme music. Sound design, musical scoring, and mixing by Brad Stratton. Cover design by Ryan Ho and Jane Zisman. Embroidery by Women of Kandahar Treasure. Additional audio and video by Nicholas Brennan, Megan Dean, and KK, with special thanks to Clayton Swisher. For more information on the people featured in this podcast and additional interviews, visit kabulfalling.com.
Audiation.